All right, let's get started. Hello, everybody, and welcome to CHPC's Equitable Enforcement event. We're so happy to have you all here today with our colleagues from Hester Street, the New York Times, and Professor Dr. Ellen Pater. We want to talk a little bit about some of CHPC's other projects before kicking off this incredible program here today. If you have any questions, we'll do a Q&A at the end of all the presentations, so please feel free to put your questions in the Q&A or the chat. And we're really excited for a robust discussion today. So thank you all for joining us. First, I want to thank, of course, our sponsors. Normally, we would be doing a very large event, and everyone's looking at the texts and emails from a year ago today. This time last year, we were talking about whether or not we really needed to cancel our indoor 1,000 person chicken lunch in Times Square. And of course, ultimately ended up canceling it. We're not quite ready to do events that type this year, but we really hope to be back at it next year. So in the meantime, we're just really grateful to our sponsors who have hung in there while we go virtual and do a series of web events instead of our usual luncheon where we can get everyone together and have some drinks. Cheers to doing that again next year. And in the meantime, thank you so much to our sponsors. And if there's any folks who want to be sponsors of our upcoming events, please feel free to reach out. We've also had some amazing foundation partners this year who have really helped us sail through this year, navigate this incredibly difficult time, and continue to do some really amazing work. I'm so proud of what this team has produced in this really challenging year. And we've had some really great foundations have our backs during this time. So thank you so much to all of our philanthropy partners. So there's a few projects that I just want to highlight. You'll see some links to those in the chat. The first is Housing is Essential. So one of the things we really wanted to do is make sure that we are reminded that housing policy, as we'll talk about in today's event as well, really originated as public health policy. That was the whole purpose of housing policy. So while we've really departed from that over the course of the last several generations, clearly this year has taught us that we need to go back to that moment. So one of the ways that CHPC is recommending that we bring to bear the power of all of our housing policies and all of our housing finance tools for affordable housing is to make sure that we're using as many of those affordable housing units that we've been created to help continue to allow our essential workers to live in New York City, close to their jobs in the neighborhoods of their choice. So we've recommended to this mayor and the next administration to ensure that essential workers are really prioritized for housing. We've done this in past disasters, and so we really think that this needs to happen again today. So you can read our policy brief about that topic on our website called Housing is Essential. We also, the equitable enforcement discussion that we're having today really grew out of some incredible work that my colleague Kate Leitch did on regulatory reform for basements. So we were kind of beating our head against the wall on what could happen in terms of basement regulatory reform, and these equity issues kept popping up. So we really kept finding that while these are complicated, thorny technical issues, that's not all they are. So our equitable enforcement event really grew out of our basements work that's been ongoing for about 10 years now. So we have a wealth of mapping resources, regulatory reform ideas on our website around basement and cellar reform. And we hope that this year is going to be a big year for some of those changes as we realize that healthy and safe housing is the key to us getting past this pandemic, both in terms of our public health and our economic recovery. New Lens for New York City's housing plan is our marquee project around new lenses for the next mayor's housing plan. So this is the most political year I think that New York has ever had, with the vast majority of the city council, most of the citywide races, as well as of course the mayoral race underway right now towards a primary in June. And we really wanted to make sure that the next housing plan doesn't just focus solely on unit counting as a metric, but actually steps back for a moment and asks, who is this for? Why are we doing this? What is the purpose of these plans? What problem are we trying to solve beyond just the unit factory? Now, again, as many of you know, I was deeply involved in the unit factory for many, many years. I really stand by that. I think it's an incredible management tool, but I don't think your average New Yorker feels that the housing plan has much to do with them. So we really want the next administration to step back and define their values first, and then figure out the tools and tactics second. So we've published already a housing plan for a city of immigrants. We have a housing plan for healthcare and a feminist housing plan coming in the next couple months. Leading up towards, in June, we'll release an LGBTQ+ policy plan. and then our green plan and racial equity later in the year. So we really want to give our mayoral candidates and the next administration some room to be creative and bold about what the next housing plan is for, and make sure that we're really using all the tools at our disposal. So stay tuned for those. A couple of months ago, I published an op-ed in the Daily News called "Ending Brutal Bureaucracy in New York City." So if there's anything that the pandemic taught us, it's that some of these, structures that we thought were, required, or, you couldn't do anything about, or were immovable, all of a sudden they all kind of disappeared. So there was some, hopefully that creates a little bit of opportunity for us to say, listen, do we have to do business as usual in all these other ways? A lot of our social safety net has this underpinning of an assumption about the deserving poor, or if you need the help badly enough, you'll pass through all these hurdles. And I don't think, it's been a very long time since we've taken a look at the procedures for all of our social safety net programs, in particular our housing programs, and really taken a look to see whether or not they're designed with the consumer, the housed person, the average New Yorker in mind. So we've really set up these bureaucracies. And again, I'm a bureaucrat at heart. I believe we have to have a bureaucracy in order to make government work, especially at the type of scale that we have here in New York City. But I don't think it has to be necessarily at the expense of the very people that we say we're trying to help. So that's a project that we'll be launching later this year. So stay tuned for more on that. And for the beginning opening shot across the bow, check out my op-ed in the Daily News on that subject. So, and then this week we did release some polling data so we could hear from actual New Yorkers, step away from what happens inside a public hearing where everybody's an expert, step away from the social media bubble that we're all living in, myself included, and really ask New Yorkers what they think and what their priorities are about a range of housing policy questions. So we surveyed 1,500 New Yorkers, and we released the polling data this week. And we, again, really hope that as everyone who's running for city councilor, borough president, mayor, comptroller can take a look at this data and really see what New Yorkers' priorities are. And that gives you permission to be a little bit bolder and think a little bit bigger in terms of your housing plan. So we were excited to be able to share that with the campaigns and with the public at large this week. So now let's get started. Our first speakers is Nisha, Baliga, and Jimena Veloz from Hester Street. As I said before, as Kate from our team, who you'll hear from later, was working hard on the regulatory reform ideas for our basements, we really kept coming across these equity issues, but we didn't really have the language to talk about it. And it just, we didn't really have it crystallized in our mind, a sort of theoretical framework for this. Enter Hester Street, and we saw this amazing report that they had done that suddenly sort of brought to light all the amazing work that they've been doing, and really sort of brought into relief some of the challenges that we've been seeing in our basements work, which we had previously thought of as being more technical. So we're very excited to work with Hester Street on this project, and I'm going to hand it over to Nisha and Jimena to present their amazing report. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Jessica. Thank you, Kate, and CHPC for inviting us to be part of this panel. I think once you stop sharing, Jessica, I can pull up my presentation. Perfect. Thank you. It's a real honor to be here among folks that are sort of really passionate about this work. I will say that Hester Street is like a convert to code enforcement. We were able to dig into this work thanks to funding and support from the New York Attorney General's office in a work we did all across New York State, really looking at code enforcement and how it touches so many aspects of neighborhood health and preservation, displacement, so on and so forth. And so what we want to do today is sort of walk you through some of the work we did there and some of the case studies that we feel are really relevant to any city, and particularly New York City, because the issues are universal on how code enforcement intersects with equity issues. So thank you so much for that. So, code enforcement mission is really to keep homes and neighborhoods safe and healthy. That's sort of the core mission statement of code enforcement. It allows you to restore distressed property, keep landlords accountable, make vacant lots safe, protect low-income tenants and homeowners, vulnerable communities, especially from safety issues, preserve neighborhoods at large, and also just increase neighborhood resilience. So it really is a tool that can touch all these different aspects of neighborhood safety and health. And at the same time, the actual act of enforcing code enforcement is sort of at this stage punitive. And so it disproportionately impacts communities of color. And so, you know, often priority areas for enforcement are low-income communities of color. There's a relationship there to redlining, urban renewal, so on and so forth. The people that are most vulnerable for at low housing or bad housing conditions have a fear of eviction or detention from ICE, and so they would probably not report some of the really appalling housing conditions. And then we know that research has shown, and we're going to talk a little bit more about this, is people of color receive more violations in gentrifying neighborhoods, especially in terms of noise violations and minor violations, and that takes away energy from and resources from really life safety issues. And then often there's no social support for residents who are displaced from a condemnation or an unsafe health condition. We also see that housing voucher recipients, folks that get Section 8 or other housing vouchers, are placed in low quality housing. They're doubly vulnerable. So they're already vulnerable from income disparities, but then they're placed in poor housing conditions. And then, you know, when you're looking at homeowners often, and this is what a case that we're going to talk about, is, elderly folks or low-income homeowners who sort of have an investment in the property ladder and are sort of have housing equity. They can't address these code violations that sort of continue to pile up. So, and then also we have sort of large landlords who might get fines, but they do the kind of calculus of, I'd rather just pay the fine because it's cheaper than actually taking care of the root cause of the issue. So there's all these ways in which code enforcement digresses from its goal, which is creating healthy homes and neighborhoods. And that disproportionately impacts low-income communities of color. And it's not random, right? Like we said, this is due to a history of disinvestment, redlining, urban renewal. This is compounded by lower rates of access to credit, home appraisal rates, and home ownership rates for Black and Brown communities. So they don't have the resources to deal with code violations. And then, you know, we've seen that these issues have been further exacerbated by the foreclosure crisis in 2008. And then now with COVID-19, where people have real housing insecurity created by loss of income, again, disproportionately for service workers and vulnerable communities. And then, you know, while the goal of code enforcement is health and safety and safe homes, the actual process and policies are designed by unequal systems, right? And they still reflect these implicit biases, viewpoints, and limitations. And so what we really wanted to do is think about how can we uncover these and correct for them proactively. You know, it's not all on gloom and doom, because, you know, code enforcement is this really unique governmental function where code enforcement officers really have a deep knowledge about on the ground about housing conditions in neighborhoods and residents. There's not very many kind of built environment actions. You know, planning often happens in offices or that are sort of removed from the day-to-day interaction with what's happening in a neighborhood. And code enforcement officers, we really see them as these first responders of the built environment. As they go and inspect, they also just get a sense of what's happening in the neighborhood, what's happening on the street. You know, they understand who the sort of leaders are, what areas are active, what are not. And then when they go into a home, they not only are sort of inspecting for like maybe lead or other things, but they kind of get an assessment of what's happening in that home. And so they have this really unique purview. But at the same time, the tools at their disposal of just writing a ticket, violations or fine, are not often the right ones to deal with the root causes of the violation. So it's also frustrating, you know, so code enforcement officers have this unique opportunity, but they're also often tied down by the system that they're working within. And so we really feel like that through this work that we did in Cities Rise, there's like a real opportunity to adopt an approach that put equity front and center to help guide code enforcement actions to what the original goals are, which is safety and neighborhood preservation. So how do we reimagine code enforcement? I think one of the things that we really talk about is like understanding that people are coming from different places, and we're going to talk about sort of the history of that. We're going to talk about these these case studies where you hear from people who've been impacted, but not really employ code enforcement with this sort of one size fits all, which is like, you know, equality. So assuming everybody's coming from the same situation or the same resources, but really understand what each community and different types of vulnerable communities need and proactively address that. So understanding that the starting point is really different for different people. So, you know, making that distinction between equity and equality is really important, so that the end goal, like we call liberation, is that we're meeting this end goal of code enforcement, which is quality and safe housing for all, because housing is healthcare, as we just talked about. And when we went through this work, we sort of came up with 5 principles for an equitable code enforcement process, and we'll talk a little bit about that. Given the history of our country and the fact that, you know, everyone is really dealing with the impact of hundreds of years of discriminatory processes, it is imperative that code enforcement processes take a restorative approach. So not just saying this is what code enforcement is now, but really understanding why certain neighborhoods have a higher rate of violation, and then kind of proactively focusing on how can you undo the impact of that. So it should start from a restorative or lens. That's really important. Evidence-based, I think here it is really crucial, and we'll see some more examples of that, is that you use data from multiple sources. Often, you know, we really say that data is not, people often say data is neutral, but we really actually feel that is not true, because whose data is it and how are you collecting the data? And so our approach is really to combine quantitative data with qualitative data, and also with the viewpoint of those at the receiving end. And so when we say evidence-based, we're really talking about a comprehensive view of data that is just not binary, but combines qualitative and quantitative. A process needs to be collaborative. No process occurs in a silo, and we'll talk about some examples about that. So code enforcement officers, because they have this unique purview, should be realizing that they have greater strength in collaboration with other city agencies and other service providers. Community-centric. At the end, a ticket might feel like one way of interacting with people, but really the human connection between code enforcement and communities is really crucial to understand their needs. They are sort of the experts in what they most need. And then proactive. I think currently code enforcement is a reactive process where people are waiting for something bad to happen and then issuing a fine and then trying to solve for it. But how can you sort of flip that and kind of predict, using all these different methods, where you can have actions before even a violation is issued? So we really think it's important to be proactive. And so, you know, we've kind of come up with 4 ways that you can do this. Evaluate your process, really take an understanding of where are the pain points, the equity pain points in your process, collaboration, engagement with community members, and then invest in changes toward equity. And I think one thing we want to say here, and what we learned through this process, is that we understand that different municipalities or cities, especially now in a budget crisis, have limited resources. And one thing that we really learned is that you don't have to start from scratch and wholesale change things, but you can sort of chip away. If you put equity front and center, there's different ways you can incrementally go towards change, so that you don't feel like you have to do it all. And so what we really want to talk about some of these issues don't even cost very much money. They're just about having different conversations. Some of them do require investments, but they, in terms of sort of the long-term investment of creating healthy homes, they are relatively minor. So with that, I'm going to hand over to my colleague Jimena. We'll just talk about each of these tools and tactics that code enforcement could use.
Thank you so much, Nisha. And I'll we're at 15 minutes, so I'll go a little bit quick. So one thing that we did in our work with Cities Rise was to really evaluate processes with cities. And our approach is to identify kind of like equity choice points, right? Like particular parts of the process that have a big impact on equity. We used a human-centered design lens to really understand how like different actors, from like city staff to community organizations to residents from different, neighborhoods, were impacted by the same process and the issues that they saw in it. And that allowed us to kind of like identify like the most effective places in the whole code enforcement process to kind of like make adjustments, changes, and tweaks, like Nisha was saying, to really make things more equitable. Can we go to the next one? So we created, like I was saying, like a process map of the whole code enforcement process, and we did this, a little bit more in depth for each city. Can we go to the next one? And what we were really looking to was to identify like pain points, right? The really hard parts of what the process was kind of like bringing up, Sometimes that was a lack of established procedures, communication gaps, like even like the rules themselves sometimes were a pain point for all of like our partners in cities across New York State. We were also looking at opportunities, right? Like all of those ideas that different actors had about how the process could be improved, and kind of like almost how could we leverage what is already happening and kind of like to take the next step and make the code enforcement process a little bit more equitable. And the last one is, one thing that we always like to do is to like really lift up all of those kind of like things that are working well in each city that we work with, elevate them and figure out how to scale these kind of best practices, but also at the same time, like always bring best practices from other cities that are going through the same issues or similar issues to really enrich what, a city like New York City can do around code enforcement. The other thing that Nisha mentioned, right, is working with others. And one thing that we found is that, code enforcement alone cannot deal with the larger equity issues that are affecting our neighborhoods, simply because, as Nisha said, the tools that they have are sometimes very limited. So one of the things that we really encourage our kind of like partners all across New York State, and we kind of like saw them do successfully, was to build from scratch or like really deepen kind of like partnerships with other city agencies, county agencies, like city planning, community development, public housing, social services, and health were big important ones, to get to some of those kind of like root issues affecting residents, but also work with people outside of government, community organizations, service providers that have a really deep understanding of what is going on, and like really work together to make progress. I think one thing that we always encourage our partners to do when establishing partnerships were to establish official channels for sharing data and information, kind of like work together to identify like what are those like persistent problems, those root causes, and kind of like brainstorm joint solutions, right? Instead of, and creating new systems, instead of like dealing with issues on a case-by-case basis. And, similar to establishing official channels, just like really institutionalize that collaboration, particularly for entities outside of the city. Two really cool examples that I'll just talk briefly. Our partners in Elmira and Newburgh like really went ahead and collaborated within like the code enforcement team and city planning teams, and that allowed them to be super effective at addressing code enforcement issues, particularly in Elmira. They collaborated very, very closely with the social service department and started working towards better inspecting apartments that were paid with housing vouchers. And that kind of like took care of like a big issue that they had. Can we go to the next one? Another big thing that we kind of did in our work in upstate New York was to help our partners engage their communities, like build capacity and the infrastructure at the city level to engage community about this like very technical, obscure process. We helped them, we created like community engagement tools, public education tools, and like really help them to like kickstart that conversation with community. Can we go to the next one? That meant creating, partnering with trusted local organizations, go where people were at, like really create inclusive spaces for, to engage the communities that hadn't been engaged around like housing and code enforcement before. Can we go to the next one? I think I'm gonna just kind of talk super quickly. So for example, our partners in Rochester like realized that even though they had like really good community engagement, one community that they didn't reach were refugee communities. So they established partnerships and created like small meetings with trusted, local partners. They brought interpreters for like 5 different communities. Oh, thank you, Jessica. Jessica just told me that I have a little bit more time, so I don't have to rush. So I think one thing that was like really important about the work that our partners in Rochester did was to be like really sensitive to like cultural norms in these refugee communities to kind of like establish trust. And really cool things that came out of it was, that they established ongoing dialogue with these communities and even started connecting citizens to city resources that, they needed or they hadn't received in the past. And I think just like in the final piece of this, really investing in changes towards equity. I think in our work in upstate New York, our partners were funded by the New York State Attorney General's office to really invest in some changes to their code enforcement team. And some of the things that they did were to, for example, revise rules, revise structures and procedures, to really address those kind of like pain points that they had identified with us and that they had identified with their community. They created like super innovative solutions that were not like addressing just the symptoms or only the issues that they were seeing in the surface, but like that really helped address the root causes of all the issues that they were seeing. So in one way, being proactive, being restorative, and kind of like getting ahead of the issues before they become bigger. Other things that our partners did were like review recruitment and training practices, right? To really embed equity in how code enforcement officers do their work. And they also institutionalized community engagement as a constant practice. Well, not different people did different things, but some of them created staff roles to engage with community. Some of them created some of them like really decided to continue to give grants to community organizations to do outreach in like hard to reach communities. And another thing that they did was like really dive deep into like collaboration and institutionalizing those partnerships with different agencies, right? So not only code enforcement, but housing, community development, health, social services, kind of like all working together towards kind of the same goal for the same residents that often are touched by different organizations in the system. So for example, here are some examples of what our partners in upstate New York decided to do and decided to invest in. They decided to, put money toward like new staff roles to engage with community, to have case workers, to have counselors. They decided to put money towards training, both for, owners, both for owners and residents and tenants, but also towards their own staff, because they realized and they saw that they had, the tools at their disposal weren't the best, weren't the only ones that they needed. So they invested in training for mental health, conflict resolution, implicit bias. Like I said, some people decided to invest in community engagement and make, code enforcement data available. Next one. Some people decided to do direct investment, right? Emergency housing for tenants displaced by code enforcement, a stabilization fund, an emergency abatement fund to support low-income homeowners. They decided to build partnerships with community organizations and legal aid services to support residents. And some of our partners even decided to do kind of like direct support for residents. So when residents weren't able to pay, they would like support with like a revolving with a loan fund, or have a displacement fund in case tenants needed any support. So, those are a lot of, like a little peek of what we've seen in our work in upstate New York. And we're happy to talk a little bit more. If you want to know a little bit more about our process, here are some resources that we created. The one on the right is our report and framework for equitable code enforcement. The one on the left is an engagement guide to like really engage communities around the topic, like the very technical topic of code enforcement. Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you so much, Nisha and Jimena. I'm going to share my screen if you give me 1 second. All right, I hope everyone can see that. All right, so I just want to thank everyone again for joining us today, in particular our amazing panelists. So I'd like to start by spending a little time thinking about how New York City approaches code enforcement and why it's important for us to scrutinize our practice through an explicit equity lens. So first, I just want to say that enforcement work is extremely important and difficult. There is little acknowledgement when things go right and people stay safe, and there is a bright and unforgiving spotlight when things go wrong. And New York City strives to keep the built environment safe for everyone, from a renter in a row house to a steel worker harnessed to a new high rise. This is an enormous responsibility in a very large city full of diverse stakeholders, and the primary tool that we use to ensure safety is the enforcement of New York City's construction, administrative, housing maintenance, and health codes. And as Hester Street mentioned, code enforcement officers are the city's frontline responders to concerns about the built environment. So this is a very simplified look at New York City's code enforcement system. Enforcement actions typically begin in one of 3 ways: in response to a 311 complaint, or to applications for new work or renovations, or proactively. And just to give you a sense of scale for each of these enforcement catalysts, DOB and HPD collectively received hundreds of thousands of complaints through 311 in 2020, according to open data and the Mayor's Management Report. DOB reviewed 106,000 job filings and conducted 168,000 construction inspections. Additionally, HPD conducted about 500 proactive inspections, and those are buildings that were previously identified as problematic. So the boxes that you're looking at represent the 3 arms of our municipal government that are primarily responsible for residential code enforcement. DOB enforces the multiple dwelling law, construction and energy codes, and the zoning resolution. HPD is responsible for enforcing the housing maintenance code, and DOHMH responds to health hazards like air quality and lead paint. Surprisingly, each agency reports to different deputy mayors. DOB reports to the deputy mayor for operations. HPD reports to the deputy mayor of housing and economic development. And DOHMH, of course, reports to the deputy mayor of health and human services. So it makes sense that each agency has different priorities and mandates, and it shouldn't be surprising that they can work at cross purposes. The system is not just defined by these codes and regulations, but also by legal precedent, written procedures, data collection methods and management tools, agency norms, and individual incentives. So the scale and complexity of New York's system alone should seem to warrant careful consideration through an equity lens. So as Hester Street noted, enforcement has the power to do great things. It can revitalize neighborhoods, improve children's health outcomes, protect us from poor housing conditions, and strengthen communities. But code enforcement, like any other program or policy, can have unintended consequences. Code enforcement can even work against other important housing goals by thwarting affordable housing creation and preservation, destabilizing neighborhoods, and disproportionately penalizing and displacing New York's most vulnerable populations, particularly the elderly, low-income immigrant communities, and communities of color. So it's also important to remember that our current system advantages the powerful within a community, those with the privilege and who have the comfort and the resources to navigate government systems. This can result in the government prioritizing the demands of those with the loudest voices, which unfortunately we've been seeing recently with the Lucerne on the Upper West Side. It can result in the weaponization of the enforcement system, and it can also result in neglect of neighborhoods with the greatest need. Oops. So the biases underpinning a complaint-driven system like ours can be obvious. If you map 311 complaints, you can see hotspots in neighborhoods that don't necessarily have the worst housing stock. But weaponization of the system isn't quite as obvious because you can't overlay that on a map and make it more transparent. This slide attempts to show two recent examples of the weaponization of our enforcement system. On the top is an excerpt from a 311 complaint against a shelter in Queens that predominantly serves the elderly of its community. The caller accused the shelter of illegally hiring undocumented workers on the property, though I sincerely doubt the caller had checked anyone's documents before calling. And the second example here, some of you may have seen in The Gothamist. Following the New York City outbreak of the coronavirus, residents of Bay Ridge and Diker Heights began seeing these racist flyers warning that Chinese New Yorkers were ruining neighborhoods with illegal home conversions and pushing out the middle class. Reporting an illegal conversion to 311 is a frequently used tactic we've found for penalizing a neighbor with additional government scrutiny. Repeated complaints pose an inconvenience at best and can result in harassment, financial losses, and even displacement at worst. That's a lot of power to put in the hands of an anonymous. I want to introduce you to one of my favorite people, a lovely woman who we will call Mrs. V. She has struggled with the code enforcement process for about 2 years now. She is a 90-year-old widow in the Bronx, and she's been issued multiple violations because the contractor that she and her husband hired in the 1960s, they hired the contractor to convert the basement of their home into an apartment. The contractor had completed the work without filing the appropriate documents with DOB. So she's rented out what she thought was a legal unit for over 50 years, first to her ailing mother-in-law, later to a Section 8 tenant, and most recently to a retired city employee. And her tenant is more like family than a tenant in her unit. He checks on her, he buys her milk, he drives her to the bank and sits with her for hours while she's sorting out identity theft. I mean, he is more like a child to her than a tenant. So decades after this conversion, an anonymous caller lodged a 311 complaint initiating enforcement actions that have left her with mounting fines and no viable options. So to summarize her problem, the house was built and sold as a one family with the option to convert the finished basement, it was already finished, into a separate apartment. The realtor had told her in the 60s that it has a mother-daughter configuration. So the homeowners later hired a contractor to finish the basement apartment and had assumed the work was done to code, as you would assume anytime you hire a professional. 50 years later, an anonymous caller complained about the basement unit, and the motivations are anyone's guess. Just to speculate for a moment, it could be the developer who bought up several properties on the block and replaced the existing structures with $1 million homes. It could be someone that has a personal issue with her tenant, or it could be someone who's frustrated over use of coveted street parking. We will never know because all of these complaints are anonymous. So it's been nearly 2 years since that call that put Mrs. V and her tenant into this housing limbo. And during that time, the city has continued to met out new failure to correct violations because it considers her 50-year-old basement apartment a class 1 immediately hazardous condition. Why? Because she has a gas stove in the kitchen of the basement apartment. So what would it take for her to comply? There are 2 paths: evict the tenant and restore the basement to its pre-1969 condition, or 2, alternatively, she could file an application for the work done in 1969 to verify that all of it was carried out according to the code that was in effect at the time. But here's the thing. The timing of the violation makes it essentially impossible for Mrs. V to choose the second option and retain the unit. The neighborhood was downzoned in 2004, rendering it nearly impossible to create the unit. To pursue that option, she would need, in addition to an architect and a contractor, a zoning and land use lawyer to file a long shot determination request that she can't afford. However, if the caller had complained in the 70s, the 80s, the 90s, or even the early 2000s, she could have easily made the unit legal. Meanwhile, she can't afford to lose her tenant. She can't afford to tear out the unit. She can't afford to hire an architect, expediter, lawyer, and contractors to attempt to retain the unit. So all of these enforcement actions have been taken in the name of safety. But I ask you, are the homeowner, the tenant, and the public any safer? I think you can guess where I stand on that. So in this case, it seems like our enforcement system is working at cross purposes with the city's housing plan. And that's because compliance is not a policy goal in and of itself. Ensuring safe housing for New Yorkers is, for example, a housing goal. So let's now think of Mrs. V's case not through the lens of compliance, but through what policy objectives are at play. So chief among those housing policy goals, of course, is safety. So while the basement apartment is structurally safe and habitable, there are no permits on file assuring that the contractor's work was done to code. This is a reasonable health and safety concern that forms the basis of the violation, so fair. Next is the creation and preservation of affordable housing. This has been the cornerstone of New York City's housing policy for decades. Ultimately, Mrs. V will be forced to vacate and dismantle the basement unit, which has long provided a 1-bedroom rental for households around 40 to 50% of AMI. And this unit was created without government subsidy in the private market, which is a true loss to a city that's desperate for new affordable housing. So, So what about housing stability? The tenant will lose the home that he's occupied for more than 16 years, and the homeowner may have a lien put on her house because she can't pay the mounting fines. So both occupants could ultimately lose their home. And helping elderly to age in place is a stated HPD objective. Yet our 90-year-old homeowner with a fixed income would have to go into debt to retain an architect and a contractor to pay the construction costs, to pay the filing fees and the fines and resolve the violations. And the loss of her tenant makes it worse. She's more isolated and financially and physically vulnerable. Aging in place would not be an option in that scenario. So lastly, on this list at least, we housers want to stabilize and strengthen neighborhoods. Code enforcement can address neighborhood blight and empower residents. If you remember the photo from earlier, you'll know that she maintains her home diligently. Disrepair and poor housing conditions are not a problem here. From the photo, you can tell that she gardens and has cute little flower pots, and that her tenant keeps up with their trash and recycling. And she will confess that she and many of her neighbors are longtime residents of this block. And that according to some of her neighbors, enforcement actions have precipitated the displacement of some of her previous neighbors. So given that most of us are participating in this webinar from home because of COVID, I will also add to this list that housing is an important tool to slow the spread of infectious disease. Access to affordable, safe, and sanitary housing is paramount. You can't shelter in place, of course, without shelter. So those living in substandard conditions are forced to choose between exposure to a deadly virus and sequestering in conditions that can exacerbate chronic health conditions. Our code enforcement really should aim to retain those units and make sure that they are safe and habitable. So what would an equitable enforcement response to Mrs. V look like? Well, it would consider the homeowner, her capacity to resolve the violations, the safety risk, and the policy objectives at play. For example, to effectively resolve the violations, the approach for a low-income homeowner should probably differ from the approach taken with a landlord who has a history of property in disrepair. Incentives that would work on the Jared Kushners of the world would not necessarily work on the Mrs. V's of the world. So ideally, enforcement would facilitate compliance, retain the units, strengthen its relationship within the community. In Mrs. V's case, the city could have immediately sent out an inspector to check the plumbing to see if it actually posed an imminent danger. And if given the tools, the inspector could have connected her to a caseworker that would help her navigate the enforcement process and the oath hearings and the labyrinthine certificates that she would need to obtain. And they could have connected her with the SHAP program that could help her offset the costs. So instead, for 2 years, we have violations that remain open. The public's not any safer. The process has taken a physical and mental toll on both the homeowner and tenant. And there, meanwhile, are parts of the city that need stronger enforcement and more enforcement, but I don't think this is one spot that actually needs the extra scrutiny. So how do we make enforcement more equitable? As Hester Street mentioned, we envision the goals of equitable enforcement as kind of the 4 following items. Support enforcement that improves housing quality, stability, and affordability. Reframe our code enforcement so that it's proactive instead of reactive to 311 complaints. Create a framework to efficiently and equitably deploy government resources, and to create new tools to resolve violations that are suited to the respondent and commensurate to the risk. Ideally, we would like to see the city conduct an equity audit or a review of enforcement processes and resources and legislation through an explicit equity lens. So that is our aspiration. And on that note, I will pass this over to Grace Ashford, an investigative journalist from the New York Times, who wrote an amazing piece about the unintended consequences of reactive legislation and specifically failure to correct violations. So I will actually stop sharing and reshare. Whoops. Give me 1 second to open up the following presentation. Can you see your presentation, Grace?
Yeah, that looks great.
Great.
Hello, Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for having me. I'm so excited to be here. My name is Grace Ashford. I am a reporter at the New York Times. I've reported on all sorts of things, from the president's properties to Me Too, to most recently the storming of the United States Capitol. But I've also spent some time reporting on housing in New York City, which is why I'm here today. I'm going to be talking about a story that I wrote in September of 2019 that digs into this building code violation that you've heard a little bit about, called the failure to comply. All right, so let's go to the next slide, please. This story began with a trip to a place that some of you may know very well. For those of you who don't, I've included a picture. This is the Office of Administrative Trials and Hearings down at 66 John Street. It's sort of a landing place for hundreds of thousands of citations and violations issued by various city agencies, everything from public drinking and misplaced garbage to the improper handling of cranes and derricks. I went on a Thursday because Thursdays were building days at 66 John Street. At the time, there weren't enough DOB attorneys to be in multiple boroughs on the same day. So they'd all be in Queens on one day and Brooklyn the next, and then Manhattan on Thursdays. Buildings days could be very long. There were 700 or 800 cases scheduled sometimes. So needless to say, the waiting room is packed. You've got lawyers in suits, you've got parents chasing toddlers, expediters shuffling rolling bags full of folders, and a lot of ordinary New Yorkers who took the day off work to just get this taken care of. For many, it was not the first trip. They told me they thought of it as a parking ticket until their first hearing. And then they described a complicated cycle of successive violations, sometimes 5 or 6 for the same issue. Most concerning was that no one seemed to understand why they were getting these violations or how to make them stop. I obviously became very curious about these violations, so I dug right in. Next slide, please. So it starts like this. A property owner gets a citation for violating the building code. They did work without a permit, say, or they failed to maintain their property. To correct the violation, the property owner needs to handle the underlying issue to get a permit, or handle the debris, let's say. Then they'll need to file something called a certificate of correction to actually certify with the city that the issue is resolved. If the owner doesn't correct the problem, however, or if they correct it, but they don't file the certificate of correction, they can receive another kind of violation called a failure to comply. And if you don't fix the problem, you're just going to keep getting them. At the time I was reporting, class 2 failure to comply was $800 and a class 1 was $2,400. I believe now they've gone up to $1,250 and $2,500. As you can imagine, they pretty quickly add up. If your head is spinning, I'm with you. The property owners I spoke to were really confused as well, which is part of what made me so curious. So as you'll see here, I have the total number of violations and the total number of failure to comply tickets that the DOB issued. This is per open data. And you can see they've both kind of been steadily on the rise for the past couple of years. This story was reported in 2019. So that's where the data ends. I'm going to get to 2020 a little bit later. Next slide, please. I wanted to know the origin of these successive penalties. And so I started researching their history. I found that the law that was being used to penalize homeowners was actually written with a pretty different target. Construction companies who were shirking responsibility of safety rules, and there had been a couple of pretty high profile deaths resulting from crane collapses. And so although lawmakers put out a press release where they were very clear about their target, the law itself didn't make any distinction about who or what issues the law should actually apply to. In fact, it was very broad. It mandates that all immediately hazardous, that's all class 1 violations, must be re-inspected within 60 days. If they haven't been corrected, it says the commissioner shall issue an appropriate violation. The thing is, as you got from Catherine's presentation, a lot of violations fall into the class 1 immediately hazardous category, including the laundry room of one lovely older woman that I spoke with, Miss Jean Harrow. Miss Harrow lives in a 2-family home in Queens and has for many years. One day an inspector showed up at her door and issued her a violation for the plumbing in her basement. She was shocked and confused. She'd added a powder room downstairs. She said that she liked to watch her grandkids play in the backyard, and she wanted them to be able to wash their hands before they came upstairs. And she'd used the existing plumbing from the washer and dryer, and she didn't think that was illegal. She was wrong about that. But what she didn't understand was that the actual laundry room itself had been illegally installed by the previous owners. She figured that she could just explain it all at a hearing date, but that was also a mistake. I'm going to get into that. The point is that work without a permit was considered a class 1 immediately hazardous violation, and that it needed to be corrected immediately, which meant that every 60 days, the Department of Buildings was responsible for looking back on it. And if it wasn't corrected, they would issue another violation. Pardon me, I'm just going to turn off that notification so that you are not going to keep hearing it. All right. All right, so next slide, please. Okay, so to get a better sense of the scope of these violations and who was getting them, I turned to the very wonderful, my best friend, Open Data Portal. I was able to download a data set that showed every violation and where it was issued. So I put together a list of property owners who'd received multiple failure to complies, and I started reaching out. I talked to a special education teacher in Harlem facing upwards of $8,000 in additional penalties after she failed to file the paperwork proving that she corrected the plumbing issue in her townhouse. I talked to a retiree in Clinton Hill earning a similar sum for being too slow to respond to his original ticket. He said he was in the hospital. Then there was Miss Harrow herself, who ended up receiving 5 failure to comply violations, even though she never missed a hearing. To correct her violation, Miss Harrow also needed to have the unauthorized plumbing removed. To do that, she needed a permit. But before she could get a permit, she had to pay the additional $1,500 civil penalty that accrued alongside her $1,600 class 1 work without a permit violation. Pulling that money together took months. The receipt for the payment was lost and then found. Her permit request was rejected several times because of errors that her plumber made on the application. During this time, she's receiving an additional penalty. Ultimately, the whole thing cost her $13,100 in fines plus interest, as well as permit costs, plumber's fees, 2 taxi fares, the toilet, sink, and the original washer and dryer. She now goes to the laundromat to do her laundry. There was a different permit that she could have gotten to keep her laundry room, but the process would have been more expensive and she couldn't afford it. And the thing is, these are actually the best case scenarios where homeowners are responding to the city's summonses and taking the steps to fix the problem. In other instances, owners simply ignore them because they get overwhelmed by the notices from the city and the hefty penalties that are threatened on them. I spoke with some who said that they didn't understand that each notice itself was a new ticket or that a single default ticket could run as high as $25,000. And there's rarely just one default ticket once you get to that territory. Next slide, please. So my reporting showed that many instances of non-compliance could be traced back to a basic misunderstanding of the process. The tickets themselves say that you need to correct timely, but they don't necessarily specify what that means. Many think that that means after the hearing, but often by that point, it's actually too late. And the other thing that people don't understand is that it's not just the violations, but also civil penalties. So for every class 1 violation, you will also get a $1,500 civil penalty. So a first class work without a permit violation plus a first class failure to comply, that's $3,000 in civil penalties. And although you don't have to pay all of your violations in order to get a permit, you do have to pay all the civil penalties. So this just causes confusion. I mean, Miss Harrow immediately, she got $1,600 for work without a permit. She paid it, not knowing that actually she should have paid the civil penalty because then she had to take out this time to gather the money to try to, anyway, I think you get the picture. Homeowners and property owners don't necessarily understand that tickets can be issued every 60 days. Even if you're waiting on a hearing or waiting on a permit. If the permit does go through, then those additional violations might be dismissed. But if you've made an error or your plumber or expeditors made an error, then they'll stand. And although the law does require inspectors to go out and re-inspect the underlying hazardous conditions before issuing new violations, the city acknowledged in the course of my reporting that inspectors don't always wait to gain access to properties before issuing failure to comply tickets. They just post new tickets on the door if owners aren't home or they can't get access, reasoning that they can see online whether their certificate of correction has been filed. And while that's true, not re-inspecting means that the city won't know if the hazardous condition has actually gotten worse. It also means that property owners miss out on this critical opportunity for a face-to-face interaction that could help them understand how to resolve the issue. Ultimately, we found that some of the toughest punishments had less to do with property owners flouting safety rules than with their confusion over how to respond to that first ticket. Next slide, please. And what about the construction companies who the law was written to target? Well, it turns out they were not receiving many failure to complies at all. I was able to review some documents that showed that between October 2017 and 2018, more than 100 violations, out of more than 100 violations that the top construction offender received, they received just 2 for failing to comply. And that's mostly because the DOB in those instances is more likely to issue a stop work order, which give contractors a financial incentive to deal with the issues immediately. But it's also because professional teams generally have attorneys and people who really know the process, so they know how to avoid getting failure to comply tickets. Small property owners, by comparison, are more likely to be unrepresented, unaware of the system, and unable to pay the civil penalties and their permit fees, resulting in more fines. And you can see some of this data here. The data showed also that homeowners in Brooklyn and Queens received more failure to comply violations than in Manhattan, and that a large chunk of failure to comply tickets were actually going to 1 or 2 family homes. That doesn't mean that they are blameless. You don't have to be a big developer systemically harassing rent-regulated tenants out of their homes, or a contractor putting workers on shoddy cranes to be putting people's lives at risk. One single family home that I visited had over $1 million in violations on it. It also had a lot of really serious hazards involving structural issues, gas lines, illegal occupancy order, because the owner was actually renting it out, despite the fact that the city said it was uninhabitable. The violations and the hazards had been persisting on the property for almost 10 years. Next slide, please. So ultimately, our reporting showed that these rules that were introduced as a safeguard had actually become a trap for ordinary people, and that the additional hurdle of failure to comply tickets could actually extend the time that a hazardous condition remained. We took this to the Department of Buildings. We were getting ready to publish. They didn't deny any of the facts, but they stridently rejected the notion that this was a story. They said that the DOB has no discretion and is merely implementing the rules as is written. And they called it an unintended consequence of local and state law. But some of the attorneys from within the unit that I spoke with, who were tasked with trying these cases, disagreed. They said that they'd raised these issues internally for several years without response, warning that the resources that they were spending on people like Ms. Harrow could be better used to crack down on serious repeat offenders. At the time, the agency was taking steps to expand the team responsible for trying the violations, almost tripling its size, which would seem to help with the resource issue. But there also been a lot of turnover, and there were disputes between the lawyers union and the leaders of the agency that led a lot of attorneys to quit, with several citing the DOB's enforcement policies as among their reasons for leaving. Next slide, please. Then COVID hit. The city shut down. As you know, there was a moratorium on evictions. The Department of Building inspections did not halt. They did slow down, not massively. They still needed to get out there and make sure that there were not seriously people trapped in apartments with hazardous conditions. You'll see just from the numbers here that the number of failure to comply tickets went down as well, although not massively. The oath hearings where these issues are tried were moved to Zoom, which was certainly beneficial from a health perspective, but I've heard anecdotally could complicate some accessibility issues. I also heard anecdotally that some of the other city processes that are necessary to correct violations, getting floor plans, getting permits approved, were also slower, potentially causing respondents to be slower to correct, getting additional violations. While I was reporting this story, I heard a lot of suggestions for things that could help with this issue. Simple things like more education and clear instructions in the violations themselves could really help. Violations are written exclusively in English, or they were at the time, which, you know, in our multilingual city, it can be a challenge. I believe that in the borough of Queens, there's more than 130 languages spoken. But honestly, frankly, for even a native English speaker, they can be pretty confusing. I heard some big ideas, like the one from the Department of Buildings attorneys I spoke to, who floated ideas about staying or dismissing failure to comply tickets where owners can prove they've corrected the hazard. I heard about alternative sentencing programs to help educate property owners on the building code and compliance. At one point, the city council was talking about a proposal to tie civil penalties to income. Any number of these ideas could really fundamentally reorganize the city's approach to code enforcement going forward. That said, I think it's important to remember how we got where we are today with an ambitious law that was designed to do one thing and ended up doing something very different. Next slide, please. That's my presentation. Thank you so much. And this is my contact information. Please feel free to get in touch. Tips are always welcome. I'd also just love to hear from you. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Grace. And then last but not least, we have Dr. Ellen Pater.
Hello. Let me get my slide. Okay, can you see that? Okay. Okay, hello. Thank you very much. This has been really interesting, enlightening. Thank you, Kate, for inviting me. So because we're talking about the confluence of, sorry, I just need of building codes and equitable enforcement, I'm framing the short presentations in terms of the safety part of public health and general welfare in New York City's zoning ordinance, and exploring it in particular in relationship to occupancy standard regulations. And as you'll see, everything sort of follows from the concepts of safety. As I talk, I'm going to ask you to please be aware of your own reactions to anything you see or I say. Okay. So physical safety regulations tend to be under the purview of building codes and zoning ordinances. It's really not a contentious idea about these protecting the health and safety and welfare of individuals and the community as a whole. And they tend to be based on the best science available. We all want safe wiring, we want clean water, we want our streets wide enough for fire trucks to maneuver easily in an emergency. However, assessing the validity of underlying science is just one way to look at safety. There's also the need of people to perceive a situation as safe, right? This is emotional safety, to feel emotionally safe in having confidence in the remediation choices. Will the building code lessen the likelihood of a building collapse, an electrical fire, the eradication of lead paint, the transmission of COVID now? Do they trust the science underlying the zoning and building codes don't function as told? If the answer is yes, then people feel comfortable with the familiar, at ease, and might not expend any energy thinking about the codes. So far, this is hardly controversial stuff. Right, they all interact. Where questions of safety tend to get more contentious, however, is when toxins and questions are not physical. When they move away from what science can tell us and into the messy space of people with their conflicting concepts of morality and culture. At the most general level, zoning is a social ordering of space, one that tells us a lot about the values and ideals of the people who write and revise the codes. Since at least the 1920s, when the Supreme Court decreed the municipalities had the right to control the use of land through zoning, ordinances have tended to start with a purpose statement, which is some variation of New York City's, to promote and protect public health, safety, and general welfare. Often morality, comfort, and convenience are also included. This is where we might find ordinances that have a disproportionate negative impact on non-dominant populations. Emotional safety is where occupancy standards put in, the legal number and relation of people who may live together. Sorry, let me just go back on that. Historically, occupancy standards were influenced by the best science available. New York City had some of the first occupancy standards in the country in 1867. However, in the intervening years between then and now, much of the primary scientific basis has been disproven. I often wonder what current policymakers would say if they knew that their health and safety rationale was based on 19th century concepts about miasmas and vitiated or impure air. This cutting-edge scientific knowledge in the late 19th century proved they believed, without doubt, that one's own breath was full of deadly carbonic poisons, and that some 40% of deaths in New York City were directly caused by breathing one's own noxious air. In other words, you could drown in your own exhaled breath. The codes then required 600 cubic feet of air per person, less for children, to mitigate this. And they also did make some ventilation requirements, which have been helpful. Equally as influential in the development of housing codes, however, of occupancy codes, with the moral and cultural underpinnings. The question I'm asking here then is, how do occupancy standards fit in with questions of safety, be they physical, emotional, sorry, going the wrong way here, or moral? Some historical context will help set this stage. The relationship between those who lived uptown in New York and the Lower East Side were absolutely instrumental in creating these early standards. The people who lived here were the politicians, the self-proclaimed guardians of morality, and the policymakers. They had particular ideas about right and proper ways of living based on their own worldviews and behaviors, just as we all do. They tended to see the people who lived here and in other tenements as genetically inferior to themselves. Social Darwinism was popular at the time. The residents of the Lower East Side were seen as children who needed to be taught how to act properly, how to trade their more community-oriented way of living for a more individualistic style of the upper classes. People in large multi-room apartments like this one tended to socialize at home, with servants doing the manual labor. Each room had a very specific differentiated use and decor. Bedrooms. And they had no way to create what the upper class saw as important physical and mental privacy. Lodges, even if they were relatives, were seen as detrimental to the moral health and sanctity of the home. My grandfather was one of these lodges who was seen as somehow depraved from their perspective. Yet in many cultures, it's common for extended families to live together and for rooms for people to share beds and bedrooms. I have a lot of examples from my fieldwork and others' fieldwork of people choosing to share bedrooms, even when there were other bedrooms available. It's often not just a case of affordability. The idea of sleeping in a room by yourself feels more like a punishment than something to aspire to in many societies. And crowding is an interesting related topic, with the definition of crowding having changed over time as the nuclear family became the norm. These changes got built into codes, with more than one person per bedroom in a house being considered unhealthfully overcrowded, which often prevents extended families from living together. Crowding is profoundly subjective, with no absolute numeric correlate, influenced by a myriad of situational factors, including country of origin, past experiences, relationships with others in the home. For instance, 6 family members sharing a 2-bedroom apartment might well feel comfortable and different than 6 unrelated roommates sharing the same 2-bedroom apartment. Similarly, definitions of what constitutes a family for the purposes of sharing a home have changed over time. Should it just be the nuclear household? The nuclear household plus a limited number of other relatives? Starting in the 1960s and 70s, these limiting definitions of families were starting to be seen in municipal ordinances, where immigrants who lived in multi-general households were becoming more visible and more unwanted often. And they often were legally not permitted to have this happen, which was good. But so combining work and living place was also conceptually antithetical to the upper class and thereby suspect. There's much historical evidence that policymakers often saw neatly kept homes in the tenements, but nonetheless continued to present these people and these homes and their residents in a negative, slovenly manner, when perhaps it was the character of the landlords who didn't do repairs and showed light in hallways and such like, who should have been conflated with the horrible conditions of housing, not the character of the residents. And we see the stereotypes growing. Thus, the upper class's ideas about what constitutes unhealthy housing, who should and should not live together, and even the floor plan of the home went well beyond the science into deeply held personal and cultural belief systems. We can see these morals taking hold in regulations that do not permit a bedroom to be a pass-through to another room, which can, of course, limit the number of people who live together because of an historical idea of immorality. While the regulation might be enforced equally for everyone, the impact on low-income or large households is incommensurate. Similarly, this standard that says in New York that a child over 4 years old is to be treated like an adult when determining the number of people is not based on science. It's based on cultural concepts of how people should organize themselves in space. Presumably, the assumption, which fits with other occupancy codes and cultural constructs, is that by 4 years old, a child needs a room of their own to grow into an independent adult, or that the parents need a room of their own, separate from growing and inquisitive children. Okay, so what I'm talking about isn't to privilege one living preference over another as more moral or more attuned to the public health and welfare than another. Rather, it's to understand how cultural preferences might be misconstrued and stereotypes as merely based on economic ability, education, validity of other choices that we seriously might not want for ourselves because they feel physically or emotionally unhealthy from our own point of view. Many of our codes explicitly derive from upper income English concepts about right and proper ways of living, about what constitutes crowding, about the importance of individualism, private property, perceived necessity of furniture for particular rooms, and even capitalism itself, as well as 19th and early 20th century attitudes about low-income immigrants, as I said, as being culturally, intellectually, and morally inferior beings. In terms of the development of occupancy standards, we see a particular moral imperative masquerading as a health and safety concern. Returning to the concept of physical and emotional safety, I want to add the concepts of what feels familiar and unfamiliar, comfortable and uncomfortable to the equation. It's common to feel uncomfortable, even unsafe, around something that contradicts your own way of seeing the world, that takes you out of your own comfort zone, and maybe even causes you to become uncomfortable and aware of what's going on. It makes you sometimes even question your own implicit beliefs. That might lead you to feel emotionally unsafe. And this is how the brain works. So this is science of brain. There's known the known, others living as you do, what feels safe, you probably don't even think about it. It seems invisible to you. Historically, then, housing occupancy standards and some building codes have been subtle attempts to redesign the culture of low-income immigrants and other cultural deviants, as they were considered. Consequently, they influence house design and have led to both intentional and unintentional discrimination against various ethnic groups and people of limited economic means. While appearing neutral and natural, in practice, they are the product of a culture of power trying to control how households should interact amongst themselves. Culture creates codes, while codes try to recreate cultures. As discussed, while purported to be derived from health and safety concerns, many codes actually derive, as you've seen, from outdated, disproved science and ill-founded moral concerns. Having become deeply embedded in our ideas about proper design, their origins have been forgotten, and the codes now seem essential for good housing, design, and a healthy society. The moral of the story, then, is that we should all become aware of our own personal reactions to a living situation before condemning it as unsafe or overcrowded. Is it indeed physically unsafe? You were looking at, is plumbing, electrical, is it unsafe? Yes, we need to do something. But does it just threaten your personal cultural sense of right and proper behavior? Maybe even ratchet up your discomfort level and just somehow feel unsafe. So the point of this is to say that we should all learn to ask these questions and consider the locus of our own discomfort before judging others' choices. We should also ask these questions when assessing code creation and enforcement policies. And I think meetings like this are just wonderful places to start. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Pater. So we're going to move to the Q&A session now, and then just reflecting on your presentation, it reminds me of my upbringing and housing situation growing up. I was born in the Soviet Union. My family immigrated here when I was a young child. There was 5 of us sharing a 2-bedroom apartment with 1 bathroom. I really never thought much of it. And in fact, when later on in grade school, I had a friend who was from a wealthier family, she had her own ensuite bathroom off of her bedroom. And I really thought there was something physically wrong with her, that was necessary. It never occurred to me that that was a signal of wealth. I thought that there was like a medical condition that necessitated.
That's so interesting. I'm going to have to include that in my, I'm going to have to interview you.
Great. And then the Russian language, of course, also famously has no word for privacy. It's just not a concept that exists, and it's not one that's particularly valued. So it leads to a very different set of decisions about who lives where and how. So thank you so much for that historical look, and to Kate and Nisha and Grace and Jimena for kind of how these historically grounded or not well-grounded issues have come into play into some unintended consequences here in modern day New York City. I'm also reminded of some work that CHPC did earlier this year around population density and COVID. And this was another place where these very deep-seated assumptions over decades and centuries even about these kind of dirty, crowded cities created the situation where people really believed, particularly because COVID hit New York City so hard, so early, the United States sort of developed this narrative about COVID is that this is for these big, dirty cities. And that not only is going to make it very difficult for New York to recover, but also killed a lot of people across the country when later the virus inevitably spread throughout rural and suburban areas with the same, if not worse, ferocity. And everybody was just saying, well, I don't live in an apartment building and I'm not in these crowded, dirty cities. They weren't as afraid of it. So I think that we saw those kind of norms and assumptions and biases playing out this year in a way that literally killed a lot of people. So that's something that I just want to highlight also. So I think we've learned from all the presentations today, a kind of reminder both to check what the scientific or moral underpinnings of some of these laws are, and to check both what unintended consequences may be arising from our codes, as well as I haven't heard anybody talk about a code enforcement system that checks to see whether they're actually having the intended consequence. right? I don't know if you can answer this, Grace, about whether there were more, whether there have been fewer construction deaths, whether there have been fewer crane accidents, whether we at least are also meeting our intended goals. So maybe we'll start with that question.
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to know when you're doing something right. It's hard to measure the effect, as opposed to when you're doing something wrong. You can see, I can say there have not been as many of the crane collapses that spurred that original 2009 law, but there are still occasionally pretty serious issues. There was a piece of a facade that fell off a building a year or two ago and killed a woman, that I know that the agency has been working really hard to kind of move and react to. But it's the answer is just sort of, it's hard to know.
Right. So I think we have to really craft a system that works both ways, that both sort of is on the lookout for unintended consequences and inequities, but also that goes back and checks from time to time whether the intended consequences are worth the cost and whether we're meeting those goals. So there's some great questions in the chat, and you should all keep them going. We have one question about NYCHA. So public housing residents do not have access to 311. They're told they don't have an ability to register complaints and get follow through from local code enforcement. They're instead told to call the NYCHA Complaint Center. And then NYCHA is exempt from having violations listed in public databases maintained by DOB and HPD. So like any landlord, NYCHA is required to comply with those codes, but the system by which they're kind of shown to be complying or not is a parallel system to the mainstream one. How do we address these inequities? So like I said, I think I'm a city government person in most of my career and in my heart. So I'm really sensitive to making sure that we have a system that works, that can be replicated, and that is, and that is bureaucratic in a way that means that you can follow the same rules over and over and over again. There's certain discretion that you don't want to build into a system this size. So I think while we very much would want to see NYCHA brought into a more mainstream code enforcement system, I would argue that doing so prior to fixing NYCHA would just sort of create this avalanche of violations. We know that NYCHA is in terrible condition. I don't think that we need at this moment the DOB and HPD databases to tell us that. I think incorporating them will be really important going forward, but doing so prior to bringing them up to code may just get in the way of that process. So that's my answer. Kate, this one is for you. We're hoping that you're working with the appropriate city and state reps on the Mrs. V case study situation. Are there any proposed legislative solutions that could help her?
Why, yes, there are. First of all, I just want to note that Mrs. V is unique in the way that she has meticulously kept documents. She literally has the canceled check from 1969 where she paid the contractor. So she has done everything she humanly can, include engaging her local council person. She's called every office humanly possible. And she's really tried to reach out to the entire system looking for some advice. But I'm most excited to report that Assemblymember Epstein has introduced an amazing piece of legislation at the state level that will enable ADU creation across the state. And if it's passed, Mrs. B will have what I think is a straight shot to remedying this issue, which we're very hopeful about. So please support that legislation.
Here's another good question. I'll ask Hester Street this, and then maybe Kate, you can weigh in as well. Have any of the presenters seen initiatives from code enforcement agencies that connect homeowners with home repair loans or grant programs?
Thanks, Jessica. That's a great question. Some of the cities that we worked with implemented those programs. So when somebody got a violation, so Buffalo and Elmira did this, is when somebody got a violation, they also got information on access to a revolving loan fund for repairs. There are a bunch of other municipalities that also do this, where they have a low income and moderate income loan fund or a repair fund. And these include things like West Orange has one. There are other examples in which cities kind of also, this is a great kind of combo where they pair with the local Habitat for Humanity affiliate. So when you get a code violation, and a bunch of cities do that across the Midwest, where they have a project to help low-income homeowners work with the Habitat for Humanity to address some minor violations, structural violations, so on and so forth. In New York City, HPD has a variety of programs, and I think somebody in the chat mentioned it. They have a retrofit program, a lead paint one. What we're not 100% sure is how closely the violation, like when you get a violation, are you connected immediately to that program so you know that it's available? And so I think there's a lot more in New York City that can be done to connect the violation process to the referral process, because the resources exist, but people often don't know that they can do that. Jimena,
If I can add something. If I can add something, is that it was never, in the cases where we've seen this, it's never the code enforcement department alone. It's never the code enforcement department alone. It's always in conjunction with, say, the community development team or the housing. So there is like a lot of collaboration that happens kind of like in the background for something like this to be offered, you know, once someone has a violation.
Yeah, and I'll just add that there are also some components to those programs at times where they only want to work with kind of quote unquote good actors. So there are times where the needs of the program don't match these kind of situations where you would have to have your home be free of all these violations or free of these fines prior to participating in the program, because they don't want to kind of quote reward people who have been in had these problematic situations in their homes, when really the whole purpose of these programs should be to help people have a pathway out of some of these violations. So there's some mismatches there as well. Kate, I'd like to ask you too, what are the examples that you've seen in CHPC's research of places, the ways in which code enforcement systems can pivot to be more equitable?
Sure. I have been very impressed with Los Angeles's system. They began a regular systematic building inspection program. So they pivoted away from a reactive complaint-based system and decided to inspect the entire housing stock on a 4-year cycle. So they are not relying on people to call and identify an issue, although they have not removed citizens' ability to complain. They still allow, you know, and receive complaints, but they make up a much, much smaller portion now of their work portfolio. It took a while to get up and running to get the entire housing stock inspected, but they've done amazing work and it's incredibly efficient. So you're not relying on, you know, those people who are comfortable navigating government programs to report a problem, for example, informal housing arrangements or with varying immigration status. They don't want the government scrutiny. But if all properties are inspected for basic health and safety on a 4-year cycle, you're hopefully catching disrepair before it happens. So you're preventing extreme disrepair by encouraging maintenance. And Los Angeles has seen, I think it was over $1 billion of reinvestment in their housing stock, and it's just been incredibly successful. They did start a program, a small pilot that's meant to help these smaller homeowners make repairs and connect them with resources, but my understanding is that the uptake has been low. I don't know if it's an advertising issue or what it is, but it's a pilot program that hasn't really, you know, had the success of getting off and running right now. But they've done incredible work there, and I certainly think it could be at least in part replicable here.
The next question is, I'm a landlord of a 3-family home. The required inspections are becoming overwhelming. For years, we've had to pay a plumber to inspect the sprinklers monthly. This is time consuming and expensive. Those of us that comply with the rules, can something be done to make this inspection yearly or every 5 years? And then there's a similar question, also a landlord of a 3-family home. My home was gut rehabbed through the HPD Homeworks program. We all have to pay for a very expensive lead paint inspection. Our homes have no lead paint because there was a complete gut rehab. We don't need to have the law change, but the city has to list our homes as not having lead paint. Any advice for us?
Wow, those are tough ones. But I can just say that this is where I can tell you where we heard of examples of municipalities that were not just looking out for bad actors, but rewarding good actors. And so because the annual inspections were not only creating, large costs for homeowners, but they were also putting a huge burden on code enforcement inspectors to inspect like not high priority areas. And so Rochester has sort of started a database of good landlords. So basically after you do, I don't know the exact details of it, but basically what the concept is, after you have a compliant inspection twice or consecutively, then you go into a program where you're every 5 years or every 2 years. And then so basically, there's an incentive to comply and be a good landlord. And then you go into a different tier so that they do that. And so I think that's something that New York City could also do. And I see Jessica's also saying that, but there's ways in which cities are working to really support good landlords because, individual landlords often disproportionately bear the burden of inspection that's aimed at bad actors.
Yeah, and then I'll also say that when there are these laws that get changed, it's typically in response to a tragedy that's occurred. So then especially particularly it's getting worse in New York City, but this idea of the landlord as by definition, a bad actor has really gained a lot of currency. So the response is punish it more, punish it harder, punish it more often. And I think we really have to ask the question about whether that just creates a new pathway for a bad actor to move things forward by paying the fines and make it much harder for a good actor to fix things that they want to fix. And so sometimes I think the solution isn't always well matched to the initial problem. And we tend to not think of 1 and 2 and 3 family homeowners as also being landlords. And we don't necessarily tailor our approach to those type of property owners. And in fact, we may be making it more difficult as we see example after example. I keep seeing these like tragic stories in the chat of this is new for us to have so many kind of small landlords and small homeowners in a CHPC event, since we're mostly a think tank and a kind of industry facing group. But since we've been embarked on our basements work and on our equitable enforcement work, we're hearing floods of stories like what we heard from Grace in her piece about individual homeowners who are just stuck in this cycle that they can't get out of, and that every enforcement action makes it actually harder for them to solve the actual problem. But here's a good question. How does the housing court and enforcement fit into the concerns raised today? How do you ensure that resolving the unintended consequences doesn't give the Jared Kushners and the worst landlords of the world a means of avoiding enforcement? I'm concerned that short of an income-based penalty system or one that separates individual owners from professional landlords, changes in the law will advantage slumlords.
I can take that one. I think this is a really great question. And I've done a lot of reporting as well on, some of those bad landlords, the way that HPD pursues them, construction harassment. These are really serious issues. So one thing is that HPD, that process, they have the ability to actually sue a landlord in court, which is different from the oath process. And, they can lodge and mount, serious, legal challenges for bad landlords. In terms of oath, though, and building violations, so what we were seeing is, yes, the failure to comply tickets are not necessarily what are getting them. The DOB has the ability to, do stop work orders, do more serious construction related issues, but those cases are more complicated and they take more time. And you can bet that those landlords and developers are going to mount really strong, rigorous defenses, which are going to also just sort of demand more resources of the department. And so that was, I think I mentioned some of the attorneys from the Department of Buildings that I had spoken with at the time were really concerned that by spending so much of their time on these little guys, they were not able to really properly, aggressively pursue complicated cases against bad landlords. And so I think, it's the one size fits all approach is sort of what we have. And that is, I think, kind of resulting in what these issues that we have today.
Yeah, and there's also no legal representation afforded to small landlords in the oath process. So we called all the legal aid agencies around town. All of them will do criminal work. All of them will do housing court. But some of these oath hearings with these technical issues, they had all said that this is just beyond their capacity. It's a very, very technical issue. And we can attest at CHPC that we have this committee that works on these basement regulatory reform issues, and the sheer number of professional licenses and years of experience and billable hours in that room trying to fuss over whether or not Mrs. Velez's doorway is 6 inches too wide or not is remarkable. And it would be beyond the ability of a particular legal aid lawyer to take on some of those technical issues. And so that really, privileges a large landlord who has somebody who's sitting in oath all day, kind of working through their process. So we really have a system that currently is privileging the ones that we most seek to punish, frankly. And then I think we're also in this bigger conversation around whether the goal is punishment. In a bigger picture criminal justice discussion, we're having a conversation that we just really started as a society about, is our goal punishment or is our goal remedying the problem? And here we have a system where the goal is explicitly punishment, and there aren't a lot of pathways to remedy. The pathway is punishment, and you hopefully will fix the problem in order to avoid the punishment. But we see every day, even in this chat today, we see how many homeowners are here trying to fix the problem desperately, and the punishment takes them further away from that and not closer.
I was going to say something to that effect, Jessica, that the penalties, the civil penalties should not diminish someone's ability to remedy the problem. If the goal is safety and not compliance, then you would want that money to go towards the actual remedy of the problem and the safety issue. So maybe there's a way to allow people to apply those fees to the remedy or deduct from the fee, whatever they spend towards the fix. And the other thing I want to say about the oath process, the oath judges don't seemingly have the authority to use discretion in these cases to dismiss if it seems that the punishment is not commensurate with, the intention, with the capability, with the risk. And the other thing about legal representation at oath, it feels like you're going to the DMV. For those of you who have been to an oath hearing, they ask you before going to see your hearing judge whether you would like, last minute, would you like legal representation? But you feel like you're just going to the DMV and you're going to explain to someone what happened. And it seems like a very reasonable exchange to have. So I feel like people are underprepared, underrepresented, and there's just no, ability in the system. There's no discretion built into the system to stop things that are kind of getting out of proportion with the actual offense.
The next question is for Ellen. Have you studied middle-income New Yorkers who choose to live in, quote, crowded communal situations? I can think of fully employed family of 6 living in a 1-bedroom because of a desirable school zone, groups of young professionals who subdivide apartments to fit more people in, etc.
Yeah, that's so interesting. About 20 years ago, I don't know if any of you remember, in New York City, it became a big thing for newly graduated college students to move in together and get these movable walls. And New York Times and other venues were saying this is fabulous. At the same time, my friends in fair housing legal service type programs were fighting litigation against low-income ethnic people who were living that way either by choice or by necessity. But so for the middle class, this was great and wonderful. for working class unwanted populations. It was not. So I think that's really interesting. And it also brings up another issue, which is people who, as you say, want to have their kids in good schools. That's a public health issue, having good education. Being in places with parks, we know that fresh air and greenery have an impact on ADHD, on public health. There's some fabulous research done on that. So these are all issues and other reasons why people should be permitted, as this question has said, to choose to live in smaller places that have the amenities that will provide physical, mental, emotional, and societal health, because we're losing our children, the future, as they say, right? By not giving them access to healthy environments, outdoors and good schools. So yeah, I think that's a fabulous, important issue that goes along with everything you're talking about, and certainly fits in with the origins of planning and housing as a public health issue.
Yeah, a couple of years ago, CHPC did some research on best practices for design and management of shared housing. And what we saw is very much that dichotomy where there's this fear of the sort of bad old days of tenements and SROs and how to avoid that happening. But when you bring that into a modern context, you paint the walls pale gray and put a $1,000 espresso machine on the first floor, then now all of a sudden it's this wonderful real estate innovation. And so there's really two different sets of rules based on the sort of impression that people get about the type of people who are living in these conditions.
And we have, I'm sorry, I was going to say, we have the tiny house phenomenon now as well, which is very middle upper class, because to get it to be of that ilk, you have to be able to afford quite a lot to put into it. It's not just 4 walls. And so it is very much, yeah, as you're saying, who it is that makes the difference.
Yeah.
And just to add that we would, Ellen, your presentation really resonated with me, especially what we've seen in Newburgh, which is a community in which there's a couple of neighborhoods that has a high immigrant population, and people have a high occupancy for the apartments, and it's getting increasingly expensive. And it's also a gentrifying place where a lot of more wealthy homeowners from New York City are buying homes there. And those folks in those houses get called on code violations for no health issue, but on this arbitrary decision that having X people per bedroom is overcrowding. And so that has also created a lot of capacity issues within Newburgh. And there is really no kind of public safety rationale for it.
It's an emotional.
And if I can add something about that Newburgh case, what is really interesting, Newburgh is a city that it has like a really high Latino population. And when you talk even to like the code enforcement team, they understand that there is a cultural difference. There is a cultural difference for Latino families about like, having maybe extended family live together. But at the same time, those are the rules that they have to enforce. So even when there's like some understanding about these issues, like their hands are tied, and they have a hard time figuring out and squaring the circle.
Yeah. At the same time, I'm going to kind of push back with a provocative question around crowding. While we've learned that population density is not related to the spread of COVID, crowding in fact is. So can we assume that something that we've sort of deemed overcrowded by our current rules, is it fair to assume that that's always just a cultural preference that we should be allowing, or is there in fact a problem of overcrowding that we should attempt to address in any number of ways? Because there's no solution to overcrowding, even though our systems all assume that it's a bad thing. Is it always an okay thing and a cultural preference, or is that something that in some cases we do want to try to find a solution for?
I think you have to start by saying, what are you considering overcrowding? How many people, and what are the larger conditions? Do you have good ventilation? Do you have access to outdoors? Do you have medical care? Do you have ways of separating people if you need to? One of the things that we see in Massachusetts with COVID is when people can't stay safely isolated, we have isolation hotels that the state is putting people into. So are there alternatives? You know, and it, you know, COVID obviously has brought up so much new thinking because we have never really thought so much about what happens if you have a pandemic. You know, that's just not been part of the questions, but there have to be alternatives, because I think breaking up families is also a pandemic, you know, and it's one that we need to figure out some alternative to. And I don't think it's a simple question. I think it's, you know, bringing people together from all these different venues is what I find so exciting, because there have to be alternatives, and we're not going to find perfect answers. But how do we have a series of proactive strategies that we can draw upon?
Yeah, then I'm just going to wrap up with this last good question that's in the chat about how HPD and DOB consider a 3-family as a commercial rental, where it used to, before it was 4. This is exactly the kind of thing that I think both in our basements work and in equitable code enforcement, we need to take a look at. We've drawn these arbitrary lines, sometimes decades ago, without the benefit of modern technology. We had to draw lines somewhere, but I think it's worth revisiting to see whether that line was in the correct place. Are there more or less fires in a 3 and a 4 family than a 1 and a 2? Is a 7-foot ceiling a bright line that is based in science, or is that something that we just said, like about this high seems fine? And also, because most of our building codes were written 100 years ago in many cases, now's the time where we actually have some of that science and technology to take a look to see if the line that we drew, and we agree there needs to be some line, is the correct place, or whether shifting it a little bit could create a little bit more opportunity for everybody. Is there any other wrapping up thoughts before we send everyone to this out in this beautiful day? Thank you all so much to Grace and Ellen and Jimena and Nisha and Kate. You guys all do such amazing work. This is the beginning of this conversation where we hope the city agencies will kind of take us up on our offer to start to think through some of these issues in partnership. So there are many city agency folks on the call right now, and I'm just wanted to let you know that I'm very grateful that you're willing to kind of be open to this discussion. So thank you so much for joining. And thank you again, and let's continue this conversation. Bye, everybody. Have a great day.
Thank you so
Thank
much.
you.